The silent cry, the twin sons of Sentinel Prime, cast golden light across the vast crystal spires that rose from the surface like frozen music. The Tavari had built their civilization over 12,000 years, not through conquest or expansion, but through patience and wisdom. They were a slender species with silver skin that shimmered softly in sunlight, and their large violet eyes held the depth of countless generations of accumulated knowledge. The Tavari had chosen a different path than most species in the galaxy. While others built weapons and formed empires, the Tavari became historians and record keepers. Their massive crystal libraries contained the stories of hundreds of civilizations, carefully preserved and organized so that nothing would be lost to time. They believed that memory was the greatest gift one generation could give to the next, and they had dedicated their entire society to this noble purpose. Elder, historian Verena walked through the Grand Archive as she did every morning, her footsteps echoing softly on the polished crystal floor. She was old even by Tavari standards, having lived for 300 years and spent every one of those years among the endless halls of knowledge. The archive stretched for kilometers underground, protected from the elements and kept at perfect temperature and humidity to preserve the precious records within. Around her, younger historians worked quietly at their stations, carefully digitizing ancient texts and cross-referencing information from different civilizations. The Tavari took their responsibilities seriously, knowing that they held the collective memory of much of the known galaxy. Species came and went, empires rose and fell, but the Tavari remembered everything and kept it safe for future generations. Sentinel Prime was located in what the major galactic powers called the frontier sectors, far from the busy trade routes and political centers that dominated the inner systems. The Tavari had chosen this location deliberately, wanting distance from the constant conflicts and power struggles that consumed other species. Here in the quiet reaches of space, they could focus on their work without distraction or interference. The planet had no military to speak of, just a small security force that maintained order and protected the archives from accidents or natural disasters. The Tavari had never needed weapons because they had never made enemies. Every species in the galaxy respected the historians and their sacred duty to preserve knowledge. Even the most warlike races understood that the Tavari archives might one day hold the only remaining records of their own. Civilization's dot this morning seemed like any other, until the warning alarms began screaming throughout the crystal spires. Verena felt her heart skip as the peaceful silence of the archive was shattered by the harsh electronic wailing. She rushed to the nearest communication terminal, her hands shaking as she activated the display. What she saw on the screen made her blood run cold. Ships were entering the Sentinel Prime system, hundreds of them moving in perfect coordination like a school of predatory fish. But these were not the elegant vessels of the civilized species that occasionally visited to consult the archives. These ships were organic and twisted, their hulls seeming to pulse with alien life. They moved with purpose and hunger toward the defenseless planet. The Morgoth swarm had found Sentinel Prime. Verena had read about them in the archives, had studied the terrifying reports from the few civilizations that had survived encounters with these creatures. The Morgoth were not a species in the traditional sense, but rather a parasitic hive mind that consumed other civilizations completely. They stripped worlds of all biological matter, absorbing it into their collective consciousness and leaving nothing but dead rock behind. The Morgoth did not negotiate, did not communicate, and did not show mercy. They simply consumed everything in their path and moved on to the next world. Dozens of civilizations had fallen to them over the centuries, and the major galactic powers had done nothing to stop them. The swarm operated in the frontier sectors, where laws meant nothing and the strong did as they pleased. Verena activated the Planetary Defense Coordinator and was connected immediately to Director Kelvin. the head of Sentinel Prime's small security force. His face appeared on the screen, and she could see the fear in his violet eyes. Even though he was trying to remain calm for the sake of his people, the defense coordinator spoke quickly, his words tumbling over each other in his urgency. They had counted 300 Morgoth bioships approaching the planet, each one capable of deploying thousands of ground organisms. The security force had already activated every defensive measure available, but everyone knew it would not be enough. The Tavari had shields designed to protect against meteor strikes and solar radiation, not military-grade weapons. Their security personnel carried stun weapons meant for crowd control, not tools of war. Verena made a decision in that moment that would determine the fate of her entire species. She ordered the immediate evacuation of the most precious archive materials to the deepest vaults beneath the crystal spires, where they might survive even if the surface was destroyed. She also commanded that a message be prepared and transmitted on all emergency frequencies to every corner of the galaxy. The Tavari had never asked for help before, had never wanted to be a burden on other species or involve themselves in galactic politics. But now they had no choice. If they were to have any chance of survival, someone needed to answer their call. Someone needed to care enough to help a species that had spent millennia serving others. Verena went to the central communication chamber, a circular room at the heart of the Grand Archive, where powerful transmitters could broadcast messages across vast distances. She stood before the recording equipment and took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She needed to be clear and direct, to make whoever heard this message understand the urgency of their situation. She began speaking, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She identified herself as Elder Historian Verena of Sentinel Prime and explained that the Morgoth swarm was attacking their world. She described how the Tavari had dedicated 12,000 years to preserving the knowledge and history of countless civilizations, serving the entire galaxy without asking for anything in return. Now they needed help desperately. The Tavari numbered only 50,000 souls on Sentinel Prime, peaceful scholars who had no weapons and no experience with warfare. The Morgoth would consume them all within days, perhaps hours, and everything they had built would be lost forever. Millions of historical records, the collected wisdom of hundreds of species, all would disappear as if it had never existed. Verena provided their exact coordinates and begged anyone who received the message to come to their aid. She knew it was probably hopeless, that no one would risk their lives and ships for a species that had no political power or strategic importance. The major galactic civilizations would cite their non-interference policies and express regret while doing nothing. The Tavari had chosen isolation, and now the choice meant they would die alone. Still, she had to try. She had to believe that somewhere in the vast darkness between the stars, someone would hear their cry and decide that preserving knowledge and protecting the innocent was worth fighting for. She finished her message and transmitted it on every frequency and through every relay station the Tavari could access. Then she waited, knowing that even if someone wanted to help, they would probably arrive too late. The Morgoth bioships entered orbit within the hour, their grotesque forms blocking out the light of the twin suns. They did not waste time with warnings or demands for surrender. The swarm simply began its attack, launching waves of smaller organisms toward the surface like living missiles. The Tavari shields held for a few minutes, then began failing section by section as the parasites ate through the energy barriers themselves. The first Morgoth organisms reached the surface near the northern crystal spires, and the Tavari security forces did their best to contain them. But stun weapons had no effect on creatures that felt no pain and knew no fear. The organic invaders moved with horrible speed, their bodies adapting and changing to overcome every obstacle they encountered. Verena watched from the archive as reports came in from across the planet. The Morgoth were consuming everything, absorbing biological matter and converting it to fuel for their endless expansion. Tavari civilians fled underground, seeking shelter in the deep vaults, but everyone knew it would only delay the inevitable. The swarm would dig down through solid rock, if necessary, to reach every last living thing on the planet. 3 days passed in growing horror as the Morgoth consumed more of Sentinel Prime with each passing hour. The crystal spires that had stood for thousands of years were being torn apart and digested. The beautiful gardens and parks where Tavari families had walked in peace were now feeding grounds for alien parasites. Nearly half the population was already gone, absorbed into the swarm's collective consciousness. Verena remained in the Grand Archive with a small group of historians who refused to abandon their life's work. They continued cataloging and preserving records, even as the sounds of destruction grew closer. If they were going to die, they would die doing what Tavari had always done, keeping the memory of civilizations alive for as long as possible. No one had answered their distress call. No ships had appeared in orbit to challenge the Morgoth. The galaxy had heard the Tavari's plea and had chosen to do nothing, just as Verena had feared. They would become another entry in someone else's historical archives. Another species that had existed and then vanished, leaving only records behind. On the 4th day, as Morgoth organisms finally breached the outer defenses of the Grand Archive itself, Verena prepared to make one final recording. She would describe what was happening to her people, so that if anyone ever found these archives, they would know the truth. The Tavari would not disappear without leaving testimony to their existence and their fate. She sat before the recording equipment, her hands steady now that the end was near. She had stopped being afraid once she accepted that death was inevitable. Now she felt only sadness for all the knowledge that would be lost, and anger at a galaxy that could ignore such suffering. She began to speak, describing the final hours of the Tavari civilization. But then something changed. The Morgoth organisms that had been advancing through the archive corridors suddenly stopped moving. Their coordinated attack faltered as if the hive mind controlling them had been distracted or confused by something. Verena heard confused reports from the few remaining security personnel saying that the swarm's ships in orbit were changing formation, turning away from the planet to face something in the outer system. Verena accessed the orbital sensors and saw something that no sense. New ships had appeared on the edge of the Sentinel Prime system, emerging from faster-than-light travel with perfect precision. These were not the organic forms of the Morgoth, but sleek metal vessels unlike anything in the Tavari archives. They moved with deadly grace toward the swarm's fleet, and as Verena watched in amazement, she saw weapons fire lance across the darkness between the stars. Someone had come. Against all probability and hope, someone had heard the Tavari's cry and decided to answer. But who were these mysterious rescuers? And why would they risk everything to save a species they had never met? Verena felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the battle beginning in the sky above her dying world. For the first time in 4 days, she allowed herself to feel hope. Dawn from Darkness Captain Sarah. Chun stood on the bridge of the human exploration vessel Aurora's Edge, studying the tactical display that showed the Morgoth fleet positions around Sentinel Prime. Her ship had been conducting deep space surveys in the frontier sectors when they intercepted the Tavari distress signal 4 days earlier. The message had been desperate and heartbreaking, a plea from peaceful scholars facing extinction at the hands of monsters. Sarah had made her decision within minutes of hearing that message, even though it meant disobeying direct orders from Earth Command. Humanity had only emerged into the wider galactic community 20 years earlier, and the official policy was to observe and learn rather than involve themselves in conflicts between alien species. But Sarah had not joined the Colonial Space Service to stand by and watch innocent people die when she had the power to help them. She had immediately sent encrypted messages to every human, military vessel operating within range, explaining the situation and requesting assistance. To her relief and pride, every single captain had responded with the same answer. They were coming to Sentinel Prime. Orders be damned. Some things were more important than following regulations and saving 50,000 peaceful historians from being consumed by parasitic aliens was definitely one of those things. Admiral Marcus Webb commanded the response fleet from aboard the heavy cruiser Defiant Justice. He was a veteran of the border wars against pirate fleets and had spent his entire career protecting human colonies from threats. When Sarah's message reached him, he had been conducting patrol operations 3 systems away. He had turned his entire battle group around immediately and pushed his ships to maximum speed to reach Sentinel Prime before it was too late. The human fleet that assembled in the darkness beyond Sentinel Prime consisted of 12 warships of various classes, from light frigates to heavy cruisers. It was not a large force by the standards of the major galactic powers, but it represented nearly 20% of humanity's total military strength in this sector. Every ship was equipped with weapons and defensive systems that incorporated lessons learned from studying alien technology combined with human innovation and adaptability. Admiral Webb knew they were facing a dangerous enemy. The Morgoth swarm had destroyed dozens of civilizations over the centuries, and their organic ships were tough and numerous. But the swarm had never faced humanity before, had never encountered a species that specialized in finding creative solutions to impossible problems. The humans had spent 3 days studying the enemy fleet, analyzing their movement patterns and identifying weaknesses in their formations. The Morgoth ships moved in perfect coordination because they were controlled by a hive mind. But that coordination was also their greatest vulnerability. The individual bioships had no initiative or creativity, simply following the commands of the central intelligence that directed them. If the humans could disrupt that coordination, the swarm's numerical advantage would mean much less. Colonel James Park commanded the human ground forces from the assault carrier Thunderhead. His Marines were the best-trained soldiers humanity had ever produced, veterans of combat operations on a dozen different worlds against various threats. They wore advanced powered armor that enhanced their strength and protected them from environmental hazards and enemy weapons. Each soldier carried weapons designed to be effective against both biological and mechanical targets. Park had studied every available record about Morgoth ground organisms and had developed specific tactics for fighting them. The parasites were tough and adaptable, but they relied on overwhelming numbers and regeneration rather than tactical sophistication. Human soldiers would use precision and coordination to counter that advantage, targeting the larger organisms that seemed to serve as local controllers for the smaller ones. The attack began at dawn on Sentinel Prime. As the twin suns rose over the devastated landscape, the human fleet dropped their stealth systems and appeared suddenly in orbit around the planet, their weapons already locked on priority targets. Admiral Webb opened communications on frequencies the Morgoth had never used before, knowing the hive mind would detect and analyze the transmission. His voice was calm and cold as he delivered humanity's message to the swarm. He identified himself and his fleet, then explained that the Morgoth were in violation of human ethical standards regarding the treatment of peaceful civilizations. He gave them one chance to withdraw from Sentinel Prime immediately or face destruction. He knew the swarm would not respond or retreat, but the message served another purpose. It gave his tactical officers time to complete their final targeting solutions. The Morgoth fleet began turning to face the human ships, their organic hulls pulsing. As they prepared to attack these newcomers who dared challenge the swarm, the bioships were larger than most human vessels and outnumbered them 25 to 1. According to every standard military calculation, the humans should have been hopelessly outmatched. But Admiral Webb had not survived 30 years of combat by following standard calculations. Asterisk. The human ships opened fire with weapons the Morgoth had never encountered before. Magnetic accelerator cannons launched projectiles at tremendous velocities, punching through the organic hulls of bioships with devastating kinetic energy. Directed energy weapons burned through the regenerating tissue faster than it could heal. Missile salvos carried warheads, specifically designed to disrupt biological systems at the cellular level. But the most effective weapon in the human arsenal was not physical at all. The technical warfare specialists aboard each human ship unleashed concentrated electromagnetic pulses and quantum disruption fields that interfered with the neural networks the Morgoth used for coordination. The hive mind suddenly found itself partially blind and deaf, unable to maintain perfect control over all its ships simultaneously. Asterisk. The Morgoth fleet formations began to break apart as individual bioships lost connection with the central intelligence. Some vessels continued attacking according to their last instructions, while others drifted aimlessly waiting for commands that never came. The humans exploited this confusion ruthlessly, concentrating their fire on the largest bioships that seemed to serve as communication relays for the swarm. Captain Chon led her squadron of frigates in a daring assault run directly through the heart of the enemy formation. The Aurora's Edge and her sister ships moved with practiced coordination, their smaller size and superior maneuverability allowing them to dodge the clumsy attacks of bioships that could no longer coordinate their fire effectively. They targeted the Morgoth vessels in low orbit that were actively consuming the surface of Sentinel Prime, destroying them one by one and giving the Talvari on the ground a desperately needed respite. While the space battle raged overhead, Colonel Park's Marines launched their assault on the surface. Drop pods fell through the atmosphere like meteors, their armored hulls protecting the soldiers inside from the extreme heat of re-entry. The pods crashed down in precise formations around the remaining Talvari strongholds, and Marines emerged ready for combat before the dust had settled. The Morgoth ground organisms turned to face this new threat, abandoning their assault on the Talvari defensive positions to swarm toward the human soldiers. The parasites moved with horrifying speed, their bodies morphing and adapting as they charged. But the humans were ready for them, having studied their attack patterns and developed specific counter-tactics. Marine, fire teams worked in perfect coordination, using precision weapons fired to target the larger organisms that served as local controllers for the swarm's ground forces. When those controllers were eliminated, the smaller parasites became disorganized and much easier to contain. The humans advanced steadily, pushing the Morgoth back and establishing secure perimeters around Talvari civilian shelters. Sergeant Maria Gonzalez led her squad through the ruins of what had once been a beautiful crystal garden, now reduced to rubble and organic slime by the Morgoth advance. Her armor sensors detected Talvari life signs ahead, buried under collapsed structures. She ordered her squad to secure the area while she used her powered armor's enhanced strength to lift away debris and expose the shelter entrance. Beneath, the Talvari civilians, who emerged, were terrified and exhausted, having spent days hiding underground while the Morgoth consumed everything above them. They stared at the human soldiers with confusion and wonder, unable to comprehend who these aliens were or why they had come. Gonzalez removed her helmet so they could see her face, wanting them to understand that their rescuers were living beings who cared about their survival. She spoke through her translator device, her words converted into the musical language of the Talvari. She told them they were safe now, that humanity had come in response to their distress signal and would not leave until every Talvari was protected. She saw hope dawn in their violet eyes, replacing the despair that had consumed them. Several of the civilians began crying with relief, while others simply collapsed from exhaustion, now that they could finally stop running dot in the Grand Archive. Elder historian Verena watched through external sensors as human soldiers fought their way through the Morgoth organisms that had breached the outer defenses. She had lived for 3 centuries and had studied the histories of hundreds of species, but she had never heard of humans before. These mysterious rescuers fought with skill and determination that reminded her of the legendary warrior races from ancient times. Yet they also showed careful concern for civilian safety. A human marine appeared in the archive's main hall, his heavy armor making him look like some ancient war god from Tavari mythology. He approached Verena carefully, his body language showing respect despite the urgency of the situation. When he spoke, his words were translated into her language by sophisticated equipment that seemed to understand not just vocabulary, but context and emotion. The Marine identified himself as Lieutenant David Torres and explained that his unit had been ordered to secure the Grand Archive and evacuate any civilians still inside. He told Verena that transport ships were standing by to carry the Tavari to safety, along with as many archive records as they could save. She felt overwhelming gratitude toward these strangers who understood that saving the knowledge was almost as important as saving the people. The battle in orbit continued for 6 more hours, but the outcome became inevitable once the human tactical warfare specialists completely disrupted the Morgoth hive mind's coordination. The bioships that had seemed so threatening when working in perfect unison became vulnerable when forced to operate independently. Human ships destroyed them methodically, targeting their propulsion systems and leaving them drifting helplessly in orbit. Admiral Webb had given strict orders to minimize unnecessary destruction. The goal was not to exterminate the Morgoth, but to drive them away from Sentinel Prime and convince the swarm that this world was too costly to consume. When enough bioships had been disabled or destroyed, the remaining Morgoth vessels suddenly broke contact and fled toward the outer system. The hive mind had calculated that continuing the attack would result in unacceptable losses. The human fleet did not pursue the retreating swarm. Their mission had been to save the Tavari, not to hunt down every Morgoth organism in the sector. Admiral Webb ordered his ships to establish a defensive perimeter around Sentinel Prime while ground forces completed evacuation operations and assessed the damage to the planet's infrastructure over the next 2 days. Human Marines and rescue workers evacuated 31,000 Tavari, survivors from various shelters across the devastated planet. Nearly 20,000 had been consumed by the Morgoth before the humans arrived, a terrible loss that weighed heavily on everyone involved in the rescue operation. The humans also worked tirelessly to save archive records, carefully packing crystal storage devices and transporting them to human ships, where they would be protected until Sentinel Prime could be rebuilt. Elder historian Verena stood in the command center of the Defiant Justice, meeting Admiral Webb for the first time face to face. The human officer was tall and weathered, with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much combat. But when he looked at her, she saw genuine warmth and compassion, mixed with the professional demeanor of a military commander. Explained that humanity had only recently emerged into the galactic community and were still learning about the complex politics and ancient conflicts that shaped relationships between species. But one thing humans believed absolutely was that peaceful civilizations had the right to exist without fear of extinction. When they had heard the Tavari distress signal, there had never been any question about whether to respond. The only question was how quickly they could arrive. Verena felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to this alien warrior explain why he had risked his ships and his people to save strangers he had never met. She told him that the Tavari would record humanity's actions in their archives, and ensure that future generations across the galaxy knew about the species that answered a desperate call when everyone else remained silent. She made a promise to Admiral Webb, and through him to all of humanity. The Tavari would become humanity's friends and allies, would share their vast accumulated knowledge, and help these brave newcomers understand the galaxy they had entered. More importantly, she would make sure that every species in known space learned what humanity had done at Sentinel Prime. The major powers had ignored the Tavari's plea and left them to die. But humans had crossed the darkness to stand between innocents and monsters. Asterisk. The rescue fleet remained in the Sentinel Prime system for 2 weeks, helping the Tavari begin rebuilding their world and establishing defensive systems that would warn them of future threats. Human engineers worked alongside Tavari architects to restore damaged crystal spires and repair the Grand Archive's environmental systems. Human soldiers trained Tavari security forces in basic defensive tactics, not to turn them into warriors, but to give them tools to protect themselves until help could arrive. When the time came for the human fleet to depart, thousands of Tavari gathered at the landing fields to say goodbye to their rescuers. Admiral Webb gave a short speech that Verena translated for her people. He told them that humanity would remember Sentinel Prime and would answer if they ever called for help again. He said that the darkness between the stars was vast and often cold, but it did not have to be empty of compassion or courage. Asterisk. As the human ships lifted into orbit and prepared to return to their patrol duties, Verena stood watching them go, with her hand pressed against her heart in the Tavari gesture of eternal gratitude. Her people had been saved not by the ancient powers that claimed to protect civilization, but by a young species that still believed some things were worth fighting for. She returned to the Grand Archive and began working on a new entry for the historical records. It would tell the story of the day humanity arrived from the darkness and taught the galaxy an old lesson that many had forgotten. When those in need cry out for help, silence is not neutrality. It is complicity. And somewhere in the vast universe, there would always be someone willing to stand against the darkness, no matter the cost. The Tavari would remember, and they would make sure the galaxy remembered too. Asterisk.